Welcome back. In this second video, we're going to look at creating our project and getting started on our game. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to open up Unity. Okay, and so what will happen here is, now I've already got this open, but I'm just going to go to New Project, and you will end up with this screen when you sort of first open it up. If it's not, just make sure you hit New Project, and we want to, basically save it here. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. One of the ones is that if you want to, feel free to go ahead and create your own Unity account. That will let you sort of download assets and access the asset store later on when you want to. I can give you my sign in, but you might as well create one on your own because there's a lot of cool stuff that you can sort of access if you want to. 3D models, 2D models, a variety of stuff, some of it for free, some of it you could pay for if you really wanted to, depending on your situation. But a good idea is to create your own account, and we can talk about that more in class. But we want to create a name and we want to save it someplace. So what I'm going to do here is give it a name. So I'm going to call it the 2D UFO game. Okay, good to give it something that you can recognize. Okay, you can call it something else. And what's very important is here you want to make sure you save it to your drive. So I am going to, I've got this new Unity project here. I'm going to save it in my OneDrive. You should save it onto your network drive. Okay, under your user number, your student number. Okay, what I'm going to do is just create a new folder. So let me just go back out here, game creation. That was my one I created earlier. I'm going to make a new folder. So I'll call it, I'm going to call it 2D UFO game as well. Game. I'll call this one my teaching one. Okay, but you can just call it your 2D UFO game. All right. So I'm going to make sure I save it into that folder. Okay, and there's nothing there at the moment. That's okay. Oops, I think I got to go back one and select that folder. Okay. Good. So now I've got my game named and I've got the folder. They can have the same name. That's fine. I'm going to choose 2D here because we're going to be working on 2D. Now you don't have to feel that, oh no, I don't know if I want 2D or 3D. You can switch back and forth. It doesn't really affect the game. In the end, you can go back and change things. It's still Unity. They just sort of set it up so that it's, defaults to sort of this 2D settings. You can bring in asset packages. You can do that later as well. So we'll just leave that. So I'll hit create project and we won't save any of those changes. I didn't make any changes there. And so what happens is it closes down. And then eventually, once it sort of reloads, basically, it will start us off. And so we've started off with a clean slate. As you can see, there's absolutely nothing here at all. Okay, and basically that's how all games start off with. Okay, it's sort of a clean slate. Now, what I'm going to do is on the handout drive, you'll be able to get the assets there and just sort of the graphics, and so we'll bring those in. Now there's a variety of ways you can do this, but we're just simply going to drag it into the game here. So what I'm going to do is just pull this down a little bit and reveal my messy desktop in the background and my daughter. Basically I've got the sprites, and you'll find this on the handout drive, the sprites in here. And so there's those 3 sprites that we're dealing with. So if you had created them yourself, you could just drag them in as well. Now I think what I can do is simply drag the whole folder into my assets. Okay, and there we go. So I'm just going to throw it into the assets. I just dragged it right onto there. Might take a second as it gets imported. Okay, and you can see that sort of folder came right in, and there are my assets there. And then that's really all I need to create this game. The rest of it I'm going to program on my own. So what I want to do is save this scene before we get started. And like I mentioned in the last video, scenes are kind of like levels, okay? You'll notice right up here, let's just talk about this, it says Unity Personal 64-bit. So it's the personal version, 64-bit computer, untitled. Okay, so that's your scene, and then what sort of game is it in? It's in the 2D UFO game. And at the moment we're building it for the PC, Mac, and Linux standalone. And so you can build for a variety of different platforms. That's what we've defaulted to at the moment, right? So before we create our scene though, it's always a good idea to do a little bit of organization here. And so we're going to create a few folders so that we can put things in. Okay, one of those things is going to be our scene. So I'm going to just create here, I'm going to create a folder. And so you can see here, whoops, I don't want to create it there. Now, yeah, okay, so what I'll do is I'll deal with it. So I'm going to call one scenes. Or scene, that's fine. And now you can see it's actually created in the sprites folder, so it's a subfolder. Don't really want it there. I want it at the same level as the sprites. So what I can do is, it's no problem, I can just drag it and put it into my assets folder. So now you can see the scene is an empty folder and sprites. Another very, very common one that we'll create is and I've done the same problem again, okay, is a prefabs folder. And again, I'm just going to drag it out and put it in the assets folder. Another very common one is your scripts, and I'll make sure I do this one correctly. Click on the assets first, create folder, and I'm going to call this scripts. Okay, so I've got my prefabs, my scene, my scripts, and my sprites. And I think that's probably all we need. So first, before we do anything exciting here, let's save this scene and put it into our scenes folder. So I'm going to click on File here. I'm going to save this scene. Okay, and I can choose it to do it in my scenes folder already. So assets, scene, and we're not going to have too many levels here, just one. So I'm just going to call it game. Okay, and save it. So now you can see here it says game.unity. Okay, and if I click on my scenes folder, you can see this sort of unity symbol indicating that we've got our scene saved. If I make any changes, so if I do anything, let's just say I move this camera around. Okay, tab it. You'll see it right away. So I just move the camera over one. It shows you this little asterisk here. So I've made a change in the game. I'm just going to send that back to 0. It probably will still have the asterisk. Yep. And so if I want to make sure, before I shut it down or whatever, that there is no star there, there's no asterisk. So just save your scene. Okay, Control S will do the same thing. I usually just go up to the menu and save it there. Okay, so everything's under control. All right, so let's get something into the game here. So I'm going to go to my sprites, and I've got my 3 different objects here that I can play around with, and I'm going to put them into the scene here. And so 2 ways you could do it. One is you could just drag it into the scene itself. That can work, or you can just drag it right into the hierarchy, either or. So I'm just going to drag it into the hierarchy, either way. And you can see now that obviously our camera needs to be set up a bit, but we do have it here. I'm going to zoom out a bit and we can see, and then this is in our game view. And you can see that the background is now in our game. Okay, so it's an object in our game, and because it's an object in our game, it has some properties in the inspector panel. First off, you can see that the name is here. There's a little check mark beside it. If I click on that, I can remove it from the game. So that's sometimes a useful way of removing objects from the game if you need to sort of work on something else or you're sort of debugging the game. There's tags we'll talk about a bit later, layers that we'll talk about as well, and the static and non-static. We'll just leave that for the moment. Very important here is the transform component. Any game object has a transform component, and you can see it basically positions it, gives it this rotation, and affects its scale. So again, this should be pretty basic for us here. We should know about these X and Y coordinates. We're ignoring Z because we are talking about 2D only. Deal with how far it's sort of to the left and right, and then how far it's sort of up and down. Okay, this way and this way. So X is across, Y is sort of the vertical. Rotation. Again, we might want to rotate it on the X, Y, Z axis as well. We could rotate it. One of those won't work. I think it would be, just sort of trying to think. Rotate X. Well, we'll see what happens here. I haven't spent too much time with 2D myself. So and we can play around with that. And then scale, obviously we can scale it to make it larger or smaller. One of those things that you can do, you can see here, I can scale it, okay, just by moving, I'm clicking and putting my mouse over the X, and then I can sort of move it around and you know, play with it. Usually you want to have a nice round number, and so I can actually do that with this here, and you can see, yeah, so the X-axis, it doesn't matter what I'm doing with the rotation there. Okay, the Y-axis, I don't think it will either. Yeah, there's slight, okay, there we go. So it will sort of fold it that way. We can reverse it again. And then the Z, because it's sort of pointing straight down, it will rotate it around. So you could put it on an angle if you want. So if, you know, if you wanted to have a diamond game, there you go, right? We just rotated it differently. All right, so let's just leave it where it is for the moment. Now the other thing it has on here is a sprite renderer. So that's actually, the sprite is actually the graphic. So it has a position and then it has its associated graphic with it. Again, we won't worry too much about these things. We can get into it later. Pretty basic game here, but you can turn it on and off. So you can actually keep the object in the game, but just remove the renderer. Notice you can't change or you can't remove the transform, and that's because every game object has to have a transform component. A couple other key points here is, especially when you're putting in an object in for the first time, it's always a good idea to make sure its position is 0, 0, 0, okay, and then all the things are set to zeros. Just helps you sort of, you know, zero it out, I guess is the best way to describe it. Make sure it's in the right location. If not, there's a little gear right here you can click and you can reset it, okay, and then that just sets it back to those 0, 0, 0. When you drag it into the hierarchy, it should set those transforms to the sort of reset numbers. If you drag it in this way, it can, depending on where your cursor is, the position might be different, all right? Now, when we had this sort of zoomed in here, you can sort of zoom in or find where your object is simply by clicking on it here, and then if you move your cursor into the scene window and press F, it will do what's called frame selected, and so it will sort of focus in. I always like to think of it more as focus, but it will focus in on that section there. And so when I look here as well, I think, yeah, there's F there, the frame selected, okay? So you can use that to zoom in and sort of find your object. You can also think of it as find, I guess. Focus find, or less intuitive thinking, frame select. Let's just do one more thing before we end this section here. Let's just put the player in as well. And so you should be able to do this on your own. Okay, just go to your sprites, grab your UFO, which is going to be our player, and probably the easiest thing to do is just drag it into the hierarchy, because that will set it to 0, 0, 0, okay, and all the traditional settings there. One thing we'll do here, instead of calling it UFO, let's call that player. A couple ways you could do it. One is you could actually click here and type in player, okay, and you can see that that's changed up there as well, okay. You could also just come up here and change it as well. Now, one thing that we'll talk about in the next video there is setting up our sorting layers. I'll just give you a little bit of a preview there. Sorting layers are important in 2D games because there's really no Z-axis, therefore there's no sort of real layering. It's supposed to be flat. These layers, these sorting layers, allow the computer to know what should be drawn on top. Now, it's defaulted to drawing that UFO on top simply because we brought that in secondary to the background. If we had done it in the opposite order, we'd find that the background would be over top of our player and our player would not be visible. So setting up those layers can be very important, and it can make it much easier to sort of choose where your player, where your objects should be. But we'll end this video here and we'll get into that in a minute.